Consciousness is a brain-based simulation of self. The human brain is constantly taking in sensory information from organs like the eyes and ears about the external world, and also introceptive information from within our own body, and using that to create a unified mental experience of self. Nervous systems are like biological supercomputers, and the program that they run is consciousness. And consciousness likely evolved as an organism's interface with the external world, allowing an organism to coordinate its own movement and react to external factors, therefore increasing its survivability. And the first ever evolved base functions of consciousness started with something like attraction to light and aversion to tissue damage, which would be experienced as pain. Then, as sensory organs got more elaborate, so did the information processing centers within the body. So after several 100 million years, those base functions turned into an ability for an organism to represent its own body, its own self, in time and space. Meaning a biologically based representation of self, stemming from an evolved organ system. And that organ system is the nervous system, with the human forebrain so inextricably connected to our conscious functions that it is very reasonable to say that the human forebrain is the seat of human consciousness. Some people say that correlation does not equal causation, so just because the nervous system is correlated with consciousness does not mean that it is the cause or source of consciousness. But that's not actually how the scientific process arrived at the conclusion that the nervous system is the seat of human consciousness. The science of consciousness all started with Charles Darwin, when he said that just like all other human traits evolved, so did conscious functions. And he said the mental lives of living things are not so different that they cannot be explained by gradual changes to mental abilities over very long time spans. So Charles Darwin said that consciousness must have evolved in gradation, and he predicted that there would be a biological basis to conscious functions. And with those predictions, Charles Darwin gave rise to the creation of the science of consciousness, evolutionary psychology. So that's where Charles Darwin left the science of consciousness. Then, through a bunch of anecdotal evidence, like what happened to Phineas Gage with a metal rod shot through his head, all that anecdotal evidence ended up leading to the science of lobotomies, in which a doctor would stick an ice pick into somebody's frontal lobe and mush it up to destroy it. And that procedure had a very predictable set of outcomes for patients. Poor concentration, low initiative, passivity, and an overall decreased emotional experience for the rest of their life. And paired with that was the study of stroke victims and how damage to different parts of the brain would result in a pretty consistent pattern of mental deficits afterwards. But there was one section of the brainstem called the reticular activating system that was so vital for conscious functions that damage to it would result in a total cessation of a person's conscious experiences. So Darwin predicted a biological basis for conscious functions, and through medical science we discovered the biological basis for human mental experience, therefore proving Charles Darwin's prediction. So it is not a correlation-causation fallacy to say that the nervous system is the source of consciousness. Instead, a scientific theory predicted a biological basis for conscious experience, and then through the empirical evidence that has now been established as the nervous system. So Darwinian evolutionary psychology is an empirically verified science of consciousness. How the nervous system creates and sustains consciousness is an incredibly interesting question. And I'm not trying to say that we have the complete answer to how that happens, but we do have a pretty good understanding of the very basics. And we actually live in the golden age of neuroscience, so this is the most interesting time to be in the science of consciousness in human history. So first, I want to go through the anatomy of the nervous system. And there are two main sections, the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system has afferent and efferent nerves. The afferent ones relay information from nerves distributed throughout your entire body and every other organ system of your body to your central nervous system. Then the efferent nerves send information from your central nervous system to your body, which enables the nervous system to control movement. Then the central nervous system is made up of three main parts: the spinal cord, the brainstem, and the cerebral cortex. The spinal cord seems to be like an information superhighway, getting signals from your body and sending it to your brainstem and cerebral cortex, and getting information from those upper portions of the brain and sending it out to the body. And the spinal cord also is involved in automatic reflexes, which don't require conscious action at all. The brainstem is highly involved in coordinating movement and a bunch of unconscious body regulatory functions, like coordinating your heartbeat and respirations. And although a part of the brainstem is vital for all conscious experience, the cerebral cortex is the portion of our brain most heavily correlated with conscious functions. And one of the most incredible resources to learn about the human brain is the Brain Facts book created by the Society for Neuroscience. They have a bunch of free online resources as well as a free PDF download of the Brain Facts book. So this next quote is from the Brain Facts book, and it's about a full page on the different parts of the cerebrum and the cerebral cortex and what those different parts are responsible for. The largest part of the human brain is the cerebrum. The surface of the cerebrum is a deeply folded layer of nerve tissue called the cerebral cortex. Neuroscientists use the deep divisions of the cerebrum to identify regions of each hemisphere as separate lobes. The frontal lobes are at the front of the brain, immediately above the eyes. Parts of these lobes coordinate voluntary movements and speech, memory and emotion, higher cognitive skills like planning and problem solving, and many aspects of personality. The parietal lobes are located at the top of the brain immediately behind the frontal lobes. They integrate sensory signals from the skin, process taste, and process some types of visual information. The back of the brain houses the occipital lobes. They process visual information and are responsible for recognizing colors and shapes and integrating them into complex visual understanding. The temporal lobes lie on the sides of the brain, at and below the level of the eyes. They carry out some visual processing and interpret auditory information. The hippocampus consists of curved structures lying beneath the cerebral cortex. It is a region of the temporal lobes that encodes new memories. Another deep structure within each temporal lobe, the amygdala, integrates memory and emotion. The hippocampus and amygdala are part of the limbic system, a group of structures deep within the brain that help regulate our emotion and motivation. Other parts of the limbic system include the thalamus, which integrates sensory information and relays it to other parts of the brain, and the hypothalamus, which sends hormonal signals to the rest of the body through the pituitary gland. These structures, together with the cerebral cortex, make up the forebrain. So, all of our forebrain is made up of specialized nervous system tissue. Some of it processes auditory information, some of it processes visual information, some of it processes taste, and some of it processes our body's position in time and space. But there are also association centers, and those association centers take in information from all other parts of the brain and all of the processing that they've already accomplished, and then creates a unified mental representation of self. A simulation of self created by your brain that is updating hundreds of times per second. And that simulation is what we experience as consciousness. And our conscious functions actually correlate very strongly with brain waves, which happen to coordinate the firing of millions of different neurons all together in a very consistent pattern. So again, from the Brain Facts book, your awake brain typically produces alpha waves and beta waves. Theta waves and delta waves are typical of sleep. Those brain waves synchronize neurons across a wide array of brain regions performing various functions. The midbrain and hindbrain mostly relate to unconscious activity associated with coordinating movement, breathing, swallowing, temperature regulation, and spatial awareness. So, neural oscillations synchronize millions of neurons, which communicate both electrically through action potentials and chemically through the release of hormones and neurotransmitters. Those synchronized networks process sensory information and create a moment-by-moment picture of ourselves and the world around us. That picture is combined with our memories to generate an emotional state, and from that whole process, we as a living organism create a self-referential mental simulation called consciousness. So, Darwinian evolutionary psychology explains the phenomenon of consciousness as a biologically based simulation which an organism's own nervous system generates, so that each conscious being is the subject of its own conscious experience. So, over the last few years, there have been multiple new sciences of consciousness created, but they deceptively frame the science of consciousness as in desperate need of a serious update. Or they claim that science is completely unable to explain consciousness at all. But that is not true. For over 160 years, the science of consciousness has been Darwinian evolutionary psychology. And if you look at scientists like John Mallet and Todd Feinberg, who wrote The Evolutionary and Genetic Origins of Consciousness in the Cambrian Period, or their other paper, Phenomenal Consciousness and Emergence, we actually have very good scientific explanations for the phenomenon of consciousness. So that is the standard by which any other competing theory of consciousness must be weighed. We don't need a new science of consciousness unless it has superior explanatory power to Darwinian evolutionary psychology. But right now, Darwinian evolutionary psychology is by far the frontrunner in the science of consciousness. But because of the deceptive framing that there is no science of consciousness, this story made it into my book, The Stories They Don't Want You to Know. Because I hope that the response to all of these new sciences of consciousness is the scientific community clearly saying, no thank you, we already have a much better explanation in Darwinian evolutionary psychology. So you can check out my book, The Stories They Don't Want You to Know, available on Amazon.